Hello everybody. In this video we're going to continue looking at some basics about animating in Maya. I now have 3 cones, a red, yellow, and green one, and we can take a look at it in the top view. Some of this will be review from my previous video, some of it will be new information for you. If you remember, this is the timeline. This is where we do much of our animation. And each one of these numbers here represents frames. So if I take my 3 cones here and I go to frame 12, that is half a second into my animation, and I press the S key, that will place a keyframe on all 3 of these objects on all these different channels. Remember that you need to have at least 2 keyframes for animation to happen. It needs to be able to change from one value to another value. And to do that, it needs 2 keyframes. So if I were to scrub to, let's say, frame 34 and I move these over here, it is not animated yet because I have not set a keyframe. If I scrub in my timeline, it just simply pops back to the position it's at that I keyed on frame 12. I'm going to start animating my red cone here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to scrub in my timeline to frame 36, that is 24 frames later from frame 12 where I set my first keyframe. That is 1 second. So I'm going to move this over 12 units, 12 units on the grid here, and I will key it. So now, because this cone has at least 2 keyframes, one on frame 12 and one on frame 36, it will be animated. And in fact, if I scrub in my timeline, we will see it remains stationary until it gets to frame 12, and then it will move. It'll translate on the translate X until it gets to frame 36, where it will stop. If I play this animation, we'll see that it is in fact animated. While this might seem obvious, I'm going to state it anyway. If we want something to happen more quickly, it must happen over less time or fewer frames. And if we want something to happen more slowly, it must happen over more time or over more frames. So I'm going to take this yellow cone and I'm going to make it do a very similar animation to the red cone. However, we're going to make it happen twice as fast. So if you remember, frame 12, nothing happens, and then on frame 36, my cone moves 12 units. In other words, over the span of a second. I want the yellow cone to happen to move twice as fast, so I'm going to have it happen over just half a second, but I'll move it the same distance, and I will key it. So now you'll see that the red and the yellow cones do very similar animations, except that the yellow cone will do it twice as fast. It'll be faster. And if we play this, that is exactly what we see. They both start moving at the same time, but the yellow cone moves twice as fast and reaches its destination faster. The green cone will do the exact opposite. We'll make it take longer. So let's have it move that distance and arrive at frame 60. So I'll key that, and then we'll play our animation. So again, remember, that if you need something to be faster, it needs to happen over fewer frames. If you need something to be slower, it needs to happen over more frames. At this point, I'd like to bring up something important that sometimes confuses students, and that is the rate at which Maya is playing your animation. I'm going to, it's a little hard to see with this lightning bolt icon in the way here, but you'll find a little icon here of a running man. And if I click on that, it opens up my preferences specifically for the time slider. And what I want to point out to you right now is that my playback speed is set to 24 frames a second, FPS, frames per second. Now, if I were to change that to play every frame, and then play my animation, you'll see that it tries to play it as fast as it possibly can. It doesn't play it in the actual, at the actual speed that it's animated at. So when you're animating, make sure that your playback speed is set to 24 frames a second, or in some cases you might be animating at 30 frames a second. But you want to make sure that this is set properly so that when you play it back in Maya, you're seeing it play at the proper speed. So now that I've set my timeline to play at the proper speed, let's take a look at some ways that we can adjust our animation. And let's see, to do that, I'll select my red cone, which currently is starting to animate on frame 12, finishes at frame 36, meaning that it's taking 1 second. Now, what if I wanted it to go faster? Maybe I want it to be animated like this yellow cone here. How can I change it? Well, one way is that I could select the cone here. I can see that I want to move the frame, this frame here, frame 36 to frame 24. How can I do that? In the timeline. In a later video, I'll show you other ways that you can do this as well, using some other tools. I'm going to hold down Shift on my keyboard and then click on the keyframe here. You'll see that I get this red tick mark here with these arrows, and I will simply use my left mouse button and move the key back to frame 24. So now the red one and the yellow one are animated the same because I have changed the timing for my red cone so that the animation happens faster. Remember that what we discussed before was that if you want something to happen more quickly, it must happen over less time, or in this case, fewer frames. Another thing that I can do if I want to adjust my animation is I can move a bunch of keys at the same time. So maybe I want this red cone to animate quickly, like the yellow one, but I want to move the whole animation over so that it arrives at the same time as the green cone, which arrives at frame 60. Once again, I'll select my red cone, and I will select the animation here, but this time, instead of just selecting one key, I'm going to hold down Shift, and then I'm going to use my left mouse button and select a range in the timeline here. And then, grabbing these arrows, I'll move it so that the last keyframe arrives at frame 60. Now, you'll see that the red cone is animated at a similar speed to the yellow one. However, the animation starts later, and the red and the green cone arrive at exactly the same time. We'll play the animation and check this out. Now remember that you can animate all these different channels that you can see in your channel box. I'm going to place a key on all three of these on frame 60 just to make sure everything is keyframed. I'm going to go half a second later, so 12 frames later to frame 72, and I will rotate my three cones 180 degrees, and I will key that. And I will have them return to their original position. And we'll do that over the span of, let's say, 1 second. So I'll go to frame 96. And I will key it. And let's play our animation. A couple other things perhaps that we should take a look at while we talk about the timeline here is that currently it's set to its default starting at frame 1 and going to frame 120. But I can change that range of my timeline either by using this here. I can make the timeline happen over less time or more time. Now it goes to frame 200. I can also manually type in these values. Let's say I want my animation to be 500 frames long. I'll simply type in 500, and now my timeline goes from frame 1 all the way to frame 500. I'm going to change it back to 120. Another thing to keep in mind is that you might want to add keyframes later in your animation. Let's say, for instance, I have my green cone here, and instead of it moving from frame 12 to frame 60, arriving here in a very linear fashion, where it just goes straight from this point to this point, maybe I want it to come over here first. Now remember, I have to set a key. If I just scrub this, it doesn't keep that change. But if I move to frame 36, move the cone to its desired location, and set a key by pressing S, the cone will now come down here to frame 36 and then arrive here at the same time as it did before at frame 60. Now, if I decide, in fact, I don't want that keyframe there, or if I want to change it, I can easily do that as well. Maybe I decide, you know, actually I want it to go even further down than it is now. I'll return to my frame 36, I'll move it further down, and I'll key it, and it'll now take that change. Or I can get rid of the key altogether if I decide that that is in fact not what I want. I will go to the keyframe, Shift, click, right click, and cut. And now that keyframe is gone. In fact, let me correct myself there. I'm going to set the keyframe here. Once again on frame 36, so it comes down like that. You don't need to hold down Shift to delete that key. you can simply scrub to the key, right click, and cut it, and it'll eliminate that keyframe. In addition, if I want to get rid of all of the animation on that object, let's just say I want to start entirely from scratch, I could Shift select the span of keys on the timeline and cut them all. I could also select the object that is animated, come over here to my channel box, select these channels, right click and cut. That'll also get rid of the animation. And a third way that I could get rid of the animation is by selecting the cone, going to Key, and Cut Keys. And that will also eliminate the animation on the object. So that's been a brief introduction to working with setting keys in Maya, as well as adjusting the timing and working with timing.